Anywhere there are lifters hoisting heavy weights and aiming to improve on their numbers week to week, you will find lifters complaining about their achy lower back. How exactly to strengthen the lower back is a contentious topic because so much of what we already do in training utilizes it. Many think it just grows by virtue of being there. However, you could easily make the argument that despite its frequent use, very little of what we do actively stimulates the type of growth that lends itself to health and longevity as well as performance. This is the problem. As with anybody who has studied fatigue to stimulus ratio, if you have something that creates a lot of stress on a structure while not creating a sufficient growth stimulus, you're going to have less than an ideal return. As someone who's competed in strongman for nearly 2 decades, a sport that requires you to bend over into ungodly awkward positions in order to yank weight off the ground that was probably better off left where it was, I can tell you that lower back issues are not uncommon in the field. Now, many might think the answer is just staying away from such activities altogether, but I think that is a simple-minded approach. For all of the competitors I know who are plagued with lower back issues, I can't think of a single one who would have been better off in some sedentary alternate universe. The point here is not to avoid the work, but to select work that is more productive in growing us the way that we want, that adapts us so that we are not only more useful under a loaded bar, but more resilient to the detrimental effects. Through most of my journey to become a mediocre strongman, I was plagued with lower back issues. I was so riddled with pain that I was unable to put on my pants by myself, and I still had a poverty deadlift. However, by recognizing my weaknesses and forcing my training to revolve around those, I was eventually able to get my back issues under control and develop a deadlift that was far beyond what I ever thought I would have been capable of. So I want to cover my favorite exercises for developing steel cable erectors, not only to make you stronger right now, but so that you might stay in one piece long enough to become a hydraulic deadlifting machine. I'm going to loosely structure this list in order of greatest to lowest impact. That is, things that are going to start out being very, very heavy, very hard to recover from, all the way up to things that are very easy to recover from that you're actually better off doing on a day-to-day basis. So up first, thing number one is the deadlift. The deadlift puts you in the strongest mechanical position you can get in and allows for the greatest amount of weight to be lifted. It also utilizes just about every muscle in the body, from your ears all the way down to your ankles. That creates a huge systemic stress. Now, more so than just general stress, it puts a ton of stress on the low back because that is where torque is the absolute highest. You have your spine, which has to be levered up in order to complete the movement. And it's essentially comprised of a bunch of little Lego pieces. The only way that it maintains rigidness is if all of the muscles surrounding the spine maintain enough tension to keep it rigid. This isn't just important for eliminating potential wear or eliminating achiness in the low back. It's important for an efficient deadlift. You are not going to efficiently transfer force from the ground onto the bar if there is a lot of movement or if you don't have the ability to maintain that rigidness in the midsection. So while the deadlift is a great developmental tool, and a population that deadlifts as a rule is going to be stronger and more resilient than a population that doesn't, some of the people that lean on deadlifts in order to get that strong back, in order to get that resilience to injury and that increased functionality in day-to-day life, some of those people will end up in a position where they have a hard time getting the growth to occur at a rate that outpaces the accumulation of stress. It may not be common, it may not be everybody, but it is some people. And if that's you, then you're going to want to look, one, at a lot of fatigue management with the deadlift, making sure that you are not deadlifting so frequently or with so much effort that you feel like you're starting to fall apart. But two, you're going to want to start to look at other modes of reinforcing your midsection, getting your erectors stronger. You're going to have to go outside of just barbell deadlifting, and that is absolutely what I had to do. Now, hopefully you stick around. You're going to see some things on this list that might help you with that. Thing number two, we're getting into deadlift variations. We're going to start with a stiff-legged deadlift. Now, this is where we're starting to have things that are a little more targeted towards the low back to getting the erectors stronger and also the midsection. The stiff leg deadlift, by default, the bar is starting on the ground just like a regular deadlift. The difference is your hips are starting much higher. Now, this is going to do two things. It's going to, one, completely disadvantage you. So all of the movers have to work a lot harder. So it is a good way of helping your deadlift out by increasing your hamstring and glute strength. But two, it's also going to disadvantage your midsection because your hips are now higher. That means the lower back has to brace a lot more in order to move the weight. So weight is going to be lower by definition, but also stress on the low back is going to be higher. Now, generally what this means is that overall stress is going to be a bit lower. It's going to be more localized to the low back, specifically in a way that's going to develop it. Whereas in a regular deadlift, because the load is so much higher, the lower back has to work so much harder that you can think of it taking a much bigger hit and potentially getting into that range where it's not growing at the rate that you want it to. So sometimes moving in the direction of things that are going to disadvantage you a little bit and actually put more stress directly on the muscle by virtue of lowering the total load that's being used, that can be the break that you need to start getting the type of growth that you want to see. Now with a stiff-legged deadlift specifically, I do recommend being very controlled, very deliberate. Don't settle for a back that completely rounds. You don't want your shoulders to completely dump. The goal here is to maintain stiffness. It's not so much that you don't round at all. It's that whatever position you start, you can maintain as you go. Starting in a position and then giving as the weight gets heavier or as the weight moves through space, that's a sign that you have work to do, that you're not bracing as hard as you need to be. And that's going to put a ton of stress on the low back, because at that point, you're basically hanging on the erectors. And that's when they really take a beating, when they're stretched all the way out and you're just hanging on them at their full length in order to maintain rigidness. That's not what you want to do. You want them to be tight, contracted, doing their job. But stiff leg deadlifts are a great tool. However, they also do create a lot of stress. Going into number 3, we're doing a Romanian deadlift. This is one of my favorite developmental tools. I hold stiff legs and Romanians as somewhat similar, but you can pick one depending on what your specific goals are. Remember that a Romanian deadlift, it's implied that your posture is going to be a lot tighter. You're not going to allow for any amount of round. You want to start shoulders back. You want to start with your spine neutral. You're keeping your knees a little bit bent, and you're not going all the way to the ground. So with the knees slightly bent, you're rocking the hips back and then forward, and it's a really good opportunity to practice that really rigid posture. As you come down under control, you come down without giving at all throughout the spine, and you're conditioning yourself to maintain that position. And you're going to be amazed at how well that develops not just your erectors, but your upper back and your abdominals. And I would say that this is much easier on the lower back than a stiff leg deadlift specifically, because we're not allowing for any rounding where the erectors would go through a stretch shortening cycle. They're starting with a more ideal posture with a neutral spine, and they're starting locked in. So the idea is that they're staying locked in and they're resisting movement. Whereas a stiff legged deadlift, a little bit of rounding, they're going to go through that stretch shortening cycle, which is a little more taxing, but also a pretty good developmental tool. The beautiful thing about RDLs is that they can be done after your deadlifts. They can be done on opposing days. You can do them very light for flexibility work to practice bracing in position. They're a good tool that you can kind of sneak in anywhere you think is appropriate. I've also used RDLs with great success to come back from tweaks and injuries. So that would be my first introduction back to getting onto a barbell, when in the weeks prior, I really couldn't tie my shoes, get up out of bed, or really function in any meaningful way. Anything that involves flexible hamstrings, practicing posture, reinforcing a brace, and just getting that hip hinge down, RDLs just do that in spades. Guys, if I can help fund this channel and help you solve a problem, I call that a win-win. So please allow me one moment to preach the good word of Boost Camp. I tend to get a little complex when I'm writing workout plans. Tracking progress for these programs is hugely important, but options were never great. I would write these long, complex progressions by hand into a notebook, or I would carry a binder filled with spreadsheets I printed off of LiftVault. That's why I'm here to introduce you to Boost Camp. Boost Camp is the easy way to track training progress directly from your phone. Their library of programs features countless dozens of powerlifting and hypertrophy specific programs from your favorite creators, including Jeffrey Verity Schofield, Johnny Candido, Eric Helms, Greg Knuckles, Alberto Nunez, and of course, yours truly. Boost Camp also has exclusive programs that you just won't find anywhere else. Select the one best suited to your needs and watch the sets, reps, weights, and exercises populate automatically. Don't guess at that one weight you lifted that one time for how many reps again? Have your log of training with you at all times for easy reference in the convenience of your phone. Not only does Boost Camp have a stellar product, but their support is the only reason this channel exists. So thank you, the viewer, and thank you to Boost Camp. Check it out today. The link is in the description. Number 4 is a good morning. Now, many people might think of a good morning as being inherently more taxing because of the position of the bar. I want you to think of a good morning as a Romanian deadlift, just with the bar in a different position. The bar is now on your shoulders. Now, it is more awkward. The bar does tend to track forward more, whereas in an RDL, your arms can keep the bar back closer to your body. But a good morning also requires the weight to be lighter. So it's a self-limiting movement. Because It is more awkward, there's more stress, but because the weight is lighter, it also forces you to adapt to the position rather than just adapting to sheer load for the sake of it. And that's where the beauty of a good morning is. Now, there's a lot of variations you can do. I recommend, if you're not comfortable with them, starting with the pins, where you set the pins at an established height, you come down under control, rest for a second, and then come back up. That's a great way to get them down. They don't have to be done super deep, although that is a variation that you can do. I prefer to focus on maintaining a neutral spine, learning how to brace, and learning how to hinge, and then explosively coming back, cranking the hips into the bar and coming back up. It's great for conditioning flexibility, and it really is so much more about the midsection than it is about the hip power, at least in the beginning. I really do like variations with this one. A bar is just fine, but I really like a cambered bar for putting the weight back into your hips. I feel my glutes and my hamstrings a lot more when I use a cambered bar, and I can use a lot more weight, and it's a lot less stress on my lower back. When you use a safety bar, it's the exact opposite. You're gonna feel the upper back really have to work because that weight is shifted out in front. So that's a lot more taxing. You're gonna get a lot more of a bracing effect on those if that's what you're going for. But there's a lot of options depending on how much stress or weight you think you do or don't need. And it's a great tool. Again, great deadlift accessory, but really, really good for kind of exposing that weakness in your midsection. If you're not comfortable bracing, doing good mornings without a belt, focusing on putting it in your abs, great way to stress the posterior chain without having to use really, really heavy weight. So again, you want that growth to outpace the stress. So having movements where that load comes down is going to be absolutely integral to getting your lower back strong, healthy, resilient. Number 5, my pet lifts. We're getting into strongman loading movements. Stone, sandbag, or keg loads. You don't need to get a whole run of Atlas stones. If you have Craigslist, you can find a keg near you for 40 or 50 bucks, fill it up with water and sand, and it is just a super effective tool at really targeting, yes, your rectors, but also the rest of your body. Loading is like the cousin of the deadlift in terms of hitting all of the muscles in your body. It's just a little more dynamic, a little more explosive, but really heavy load workouts, your traps, your lats, your abdominals, your rectors, hips, hamstrings, everything just lights up. And it's so good for developing hinge ability, athletic ability, explosive ability, conditioning. But you can be sure as the weight gets heavier, as you adapt to more volume, those muscles absolutely grow, and you get a ton of confidence in what your lower back can handle. Now, one of the reasons I like loading these odd objects from the ground, for one, picking it off the ground requires getting into more of an awkward bent over position. So you have to start with a back that's rounded, but also stiff. So learning how to be strong in that position is huge to getting really strong erectors and a really resilient lower back. So that's absolutely great. The other thing is once you get it into your lap, you wrap your arms around it. It's essentially like a front Zercher squat hybrid. One, it's actually really taxing on the upper body, having to squeeze. So I like it for upper back, for pec development, for getting strength. Learning how to get purchase on a stone and a sandbag was just game changing for my upper body. So it's a lot harder on your upper body than you think. But once you get sunk in, as you extend up and out, as you get your hips through, the lower back starts with the erectors extended. You're hunched over. And then as you extend through, you're contracting. So going through this stretch shortening cycle. But because of where the load is, because it's out in front of you, again, this is a self-limiting exercise. The weight has to be lower, so it's not going to come with the exact same beat down as something really heavy and overloaded like a deadlift. So that shifts the balance of stress and fatigue to stimulus in one that might be favorable. And this might actually be the thing you need to get those erectors. I tried prescribing this to a lot of my powerlifters.
Please, no! No!
Nobody likes to do it. I recommend starting small, get your foot in the water. You don't have to go heavy, but practice cycling through some reps. You can do it over a yoke bar or a squat bar in a rack, just extending, dumping it over, going to the other side, or having somebody rolling it back, and then doing it for reps. Great conditioning work, but I promise you it will make your lower back stronger. Part B, the subpart of loading movements, are front carries, super easy to implement. You get a ton of time under tension, and these are actually very, very easy on the low back because once you're in position with the weight in front of you, you just walk and you're in the strongest possible position, upright, everything aligned, everything just has to support that position under this load. So your lats, erectors, glutes, hamstrings, they're all under tension the entire time you're walking. Again, great conditioning. It's a completely different type of stress, but this is something that turns your back into absolute marble. It just turns everything into just thick slabs of this raw material that you're going to chisel down into your masterpiece. I'm a huge fan of odd object loading and of front carries. Great way, especially if you're having trouble going through a range of motion. I've done front carries coming back from injury. Is a great way to get stress, to get movement without having to go through this range that I was really intolerant of at the time. So versatile, so fantastic. If you haven't done it, please check it out. Number 6, we're now going into a back extension. Pete Rubish loves his 45 degrees weighted back extensions. There's a lot of people who've used this as like a staple accessory. It's super easy to set up. It's not overly taxing. You can get a huge local stimulus. That's key. The systemic stimulus is a general beatdown you get from the lifting. The local fatigue is what the actual muscle feels, right? It's the difference between your bicep getting hit in something like a chin up or a row versus doing a concentration curl where you're just torching it for the sake of torching it. So being able to put the stress directly in those muscles without having to include all of these other muscles that allow you to lift all this weight. So again, the weight's going to be forced to be lower, but all of that weight that we are moving is going to be directly targeted into the movers. And it's a little easier to sustain posture in something like a back extension. A little harder if it's a flat horizontal back extension, but a 45 degree, it's a little bit easier. Will get a pump in the low back. You will move a little bit through the erectors, but it's really the glutes and hamstrings that take the lion's share of the beating there. So it's kind of a secondary stimulus, I would say, to the erectors. Again, this is something where you get your toe in the water, where you start to experiment with load and with more of an isolation type movement to get these muscles taken care of. If you're coming back from a tweak or an injury, it's a really friendly one to get into. I like to really practice on bracing if I'm trying to put it into my hips, into my hamstrings, my glutes. So by bracing, you're not moving at all in those muscles. The abdominals, the obliques, the erectors are frozen, and you're putting all of the movement into that hip hinge. That's really useful. However, if you do round over a little bit, now you are getting your erectors into it again by rounding forward and straightening up. You're stretching and then contracting, stretching, contracting. By going through that stretch shortening cycle, you're going to get a lot more fatigue built up. You're going to get a pump. You're going to stimulate more fibers. It's going to go through a wider range of motion, and that means more growth. So that's a variation you can look at doing. Very easy to set up, very, very easy to recover from. From there, we go into a Jefferson curl. So now we're focused completely on rounding. We're not even worried about load here. We're just worried about taking the erectors through as much range, as deep of a stretch as we can. Really play with how much our spine can round forward, with how much play we have in there to actually get range and take that flexibility to its limit. And that does a couple things. One, it conditions you to be strong in very, very awkward positions. Now, our ability to be strong in those positions is actually really, really high. What goes wrong is when we get into positions we're not tolerant of or we're not conditioned to with too much weight. So it's a mix of the load being high, the position being really foreign, and us not having adapted to that position. That's where we run into problems. So by just spearing it head on, we can get in those positions we're afraid of and start to build tolerance, adapt to it. We get stronger. The benefit is not only do we feel better, but we're a lot more useful, we're a lot more versatile, and we're a lot more injury proof. So with the Jefferson deadlift, first you want to work on basic movement ability. Most people, I know I am horrendous at this movement. I have very poor mobility. I've practiced so many years saying stiff, stiff, stiff under a barbell and all these movements that the idea of letting loose and rounding, it doesn't hit me right. I'm guarding against it. I don't feel secure. I feel exposed. But when I do it, not only do I feel more secure, pain tends to subside a little bit. I feel a bit more confident, and my erectors just get absolutely lit up. This is something that you can potentially progress heavy. Atlas Power Shrugged, great example of a guy that gets really stupidly heavy with his Jefferson curls, but it shows what the spine can potentially support if you do it long enough to get good at it. So I'm actually a fan of these. I would recommend most people start with this as like a warm-up or doing it on your off days with an empty barbell. Be very careful about how you progress. I would focus on movement ability, getting depth and range first, and then as you get comfortable with that, start to progress load. But if you implement it, you commit to it, it's a great way to make yourself bulletproof. Number 8, reverse hypers. Now, I am a reverse hyper convert. Some of the people that I followed early on that were really good deadlifters thought it was kind of gimmicky. They thought you could really just load it up and just swing, and it became kind of pointless, and that there were a big run of really elite deadlifters that didn't touch it or do anything like that. So they thought, it's just another thing that turns into a table at the gym. Now, having owned a gym, I can attest that most people do use it just to place their energy drink cans on. But when I was desperate, when I didn't know what else to do, when I was just starting to get my bracing down, but I was still dealing with a lot of symptoms of all the back injuries I had over the years, I decided to commit myself to the reverse hyper. When nobody was at the gym, I would quietly, looking over my shoulder, sneak over to the reverse hyper in the corner, load it up and start doing work. During one of my biggest deadlift preps, I committed to doing it twice a week at the beginning of my workouts, not after. So I would start with a little bit of a low back pump. What I found was that as my ability to handle weight in the reverse hyper increased, I had exponentially more stiffness and resilience at the bottom of the deadlift, which is where I usually felt the most exposed and was where I usually had the least amount of purchase. So the reverse hyper, I have to directly contribute with one of the best preps I ever had. It's something I still use now. So this is one of the things that showed me that my ability to move weight in the deadlift did not correlate directly with my lower back and midsection being as strong as it needed to be. It was still a weak point, which is why it would still ache, which is why it would still be prone to injury. And it wasn't until I found a way to directly stimulate the erectors for growth that I was able to actually fix that weak point and have my entire deadlift just level up to a point I didn't think it was capable of. When you're doing reverse hypers, I know it sucks, all that pressure on your stomach. That's actually part of the stimuli that I think is really good, teaching you to brace while your face is turning tomato red. But do it before your workout. Your hips won't be pumped. You won't feel tight at the bottom, and that goes a long way. And I think it's useful to condition yourself to squat and deadlift a little fatigued. I mean, strongmen have to do that. They're certainly not worse off for doing it. So don't think that you have to be 100% fresh every time you go into these big lifts. This is one of the best things I did because I couldn't do it afterwards because everything was so tight. It felt like my glutes were going to rip off the bone. So doing it first was a game changer. Really focus on getting a hard contraction at the top, and you don't have to come down slow, but resist the swing at the bottom. At the very end, I like it to pull me all the way through as I put my head down and my feet come up. I'll feel my entire spine decompress, feels really good. But I'll add an element of control. I'll slow the kick on the way up, and then I'll resist a little bit at the top, and I think that adds something to it. But reverse hypers, anywhere from like 8 to 20 reps, I found to be a really good range. I'll start with just a couple sets and then I'll add sets as I go. So I adapt to the fatigue. So I'm not doing my deadlifts and squats just absolutely obliterated. And as I acclimate to sets, then I will start to add weight. And I find that to be a very productive way to milk that progression for a very long time. Number 9, we're going to Supermans. Now, Supermans are probably one of the least fatiguing movements on this list directly for the lower back, but that's also one of the things that makes it useful for who it's useful for. This is something that requires no weight. You just need to get on the floor in a Superman position and tighten your lower back and feel your feet and chest pick up off the ground with your arms in front of you. Very effective way to feel your erectors contract in a way that you are probably not used to having them contract. And cycling through a few of these is a good way to get blood in there. If, let's say, you just had a really bad injury.
I broke my back, spinal.
Or a really bad tweak. Let's say you've been out for a couple of days, you know you need to move around, but you're having a hard time figuring out what to do because every time you bend over, you feel like your spine is just going to drop out your backside. Getting on the floor, practicing some Supermans is a good way to get blood into the area. That's going to make it feel a little tighter, more secure. It's going to make you feel a little more confident as you start to handle your own weight and go through day-to-day stuff again. This is a great exercise from a physical therapy point of view when you're trying to find that first entry point back in. It's also something you can do with elderly populations. Now, most of you lifters can probably do something beyond this, but even if you're just trying to find a way to conceptualize where your erectors are, what they do, what it feels like when they get fatigued, getting on the ground, doing a set of 10 or 15 of these really quick, great way to feel those pump up. And just like with your bicep or your pecs or anything else, that mind muscle connection for a lot of you can go a long way. Now, this is also at the top of the list because you can do these daily, multiple times a day. These aren't going to have a big punch associated with them as far as recovery, but they do have a little bit of stimulus. And if you're not used to that stimulus, that might be the thing you need to bridge you into more aggressive work. So I thought it was worth putting these on the list. And lastly, number 10, we have just generic bracing. If you've watched my channel at all, you know that I preach the gospel of bracing because it is such an important component. It is so important when it comes to your lower back in general. I am talking about erectors primarily on this list, but it's in the context of creating generally a strong lower back because that's mainly what we use the erectors for. That's mainly why we concern ourselves with having strong erectors. It keeps us upright, and the more upright, the more secure we can be in that position, the more efficient we're going to be when we lift. So bracing is just the ability of bringing your abdominals, your obliques, all of the muscles that wrap around your midsection into play in order to keep a tight midsection that resists movement. The better you can do that, the more efficient you're going to be. I would argue the more injury proof you're going to be, and the easier it's going to be to come back when you do get tweaks that might be inevitable over an entire training career. Bracing is the one thing that lifters do not learn in the beginning. So many people have to go back and unlearn a bunch of really shitty habits when they've already been around long enough to get those degenerative effects, to get the achy back, or to get the issues that have put them out for weeks or maybe months at a time. I have plenty of videos dedicated to bracing. Search those out, and they're filled with all kinds of things. You don't have to get crazy. Pick a couple of exercises and just do them religiously. This is if you think your midsection is weak. This is if you can't conceptualize building a tight, firm brace at the bottom of a squat or at the start of a deadlift. Things like the McGill 3 are excellent. You're talking about doing a side plank, doing a curl up, doing a bird dog. I really like dead bugs as a way of learning how to brace while moving your limbs. You're on your back with your arms up, and you're extending one leg and one arm out, opposing each other. And by learning how to brace and keep that spine neutral while everything else moves, that's the key that you want to implement when you're doing something like a deadlift. Any anti-rotation movement is good, where you're kind of offset. You can think of like a one-arm dumbbell row where you're offset and your abs have to resist that motion, that force that's pulling you off to the side. You can think of ab rollouts are very similar. Planks are also very good. All of these exercises are great for teaching you how to keep your midsection tight and your ability to build circumferential tension, to build that tension in 360 degrees is key to not only having a healthy spine over the years, to being a more efficient lifter, but also to having something that looks like a strong lower back. Also, 90-90 breathing. This is the thing. I consider it a secret weapon because I don't see it repeated anywhere else. I have videos on 90-90 breathing. This is how you demonstrate to people who deadlift 600, 700, 800 pounds that they in fact do have weak midsections and they have no idea how to brace. So check those videos out as well. All of this contributes in no small part to having a strong, healthy, useful lower back. So that's all I got for today, guys. Let me know how you've used these. Have you used these to come back from injury, to reinforce your deadlift? Let me know the successes, the failures you've had. Leave it in the comments. Better yet, take it to Patreon. That's where I upload my training weekly and where I engage with people like yourselves. You can ask questions. I give form checks. I give life advice. Anything you need, you can find there. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Until next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you.